The dog's name was Chester. He was a 7-year-old golden retriever, with a slightly graying muzzle and ears that were too large for his head in the specific way of dogs who grew into their bodies everywhere except there. And he had belonged to Walter Briggs for all 7 of those years, from the 8-week-old puppy that Walter's daughter Nora had placed in his arms on a Saturday morning 3 months after Walter's wife passed, saying, "Dad, you need something that needs you," to the large, warm, unhurried animal who had slept at the foot of Walter's bed every night since and who understood the rhythms of Walter's day with the specific attentiveness of a creature whose entire world is one person. Chester knew when Walter woke up before Walter moved. He knew the difference between the sound of Walter going to the kitchen for water at 3 a.m. and the sound of Walter getting up for the day. He knew which coat meant a short walk and which coat meant a long one. He knew that Tuesday mornings meant the farmer's market 3 blocks over where the woman at the bread stand kept treats behind the counter and always said Chester's name the way people say the names of dogs they genuinely like, as if the dog can tell the difference, which Chester could. And Chester knew, with the complete and wordless certainty of a dog who has never learned to doubt what his body tells him, that Walter Briggs was coming home. He just didn't know when. Walter had gone to the hospital on a Wednesday in November. Nora had driven him, had noticed, on her weekly Thursday call the previous week, something in her father's breathing that didn't sound right, and had driven the 2 hours from Portland to Eugene without telling Walter she was coming, because if she had told him, he would have said he was fine. He was 73 years old and had been saying he was fine with the specific stubbornness of a man who had spent 50 years being the person other people leaned on and had not yet developed the vocabulary for leaning himself. He was not fine. His heart, which had been sending signals he had been misreading as ordinary aging, had been working harder than it should for longer than it should, and the cardiologist at the hospital used words like significant and intervention, and we need to act quickly with the calm efficiency of someone who deals in urgency without performing it. Walter had listened and asked 2 practical questions and then asked Nora if she would call his neighbor Dennis to check on Chester. Nora had called Dennis. Dennis, who was 68 and retired and had known Walter for 11 years and owned a spare key for exactly these situations, had gone to the house that same afternoon and found Chester at the front door, not anxious, not distressed, just present, waiting. The way Chester waited every day when Walter went out, because Walter always came back, and Chester had no information suggesting today would be different. Dennis had fed him and walked him and sat with him for an hour. Chester had been polite about all of it, had eaten, had walked, had accepted the company, with the quiet dignity of a dog who is fond of a person but is not confused about who that person is in relation to the person he is actually waiting for. When Dennis left, Chester went back to the door. The weeks that followed had a particular texture that Nora would describe to her husband later as the strangest grief she had ever felt for a person who was still alive. Walter was in the hospital, then in a cardiac care unit, then in a rehabilitation facility 30 minutes from Eugene, where the staff called him Mr. Briggs, and he called them by their first names within 48 hours because Walter Briggs had never in his life called anyone by anything other than their first name, regardless of the context. He was going to be all right. That was established within the first week. The intervention had been successful. The heart was responding. The cardiologist used words like encouraging and good trajectory with the same calm efficiency he had used for the urgent words. But all right was a process, not an event, and the process was going to take time. And time meant weeks. And weeks meant Chester at the front door of a house in Eugene, Oregon, waiting for footsteps he recognized on the front path. Dennis came twice a day. He fed Chester, walked him, sat with him in the evenings when Dennis's own house felt too quiet. He was not a dog person by nature, had never owned a dog, had always thought of them as a level of commitment he hadn't wanted, but Chester had a quality that made the category irrelevant. He was simply present, and his presence had a weight to it, a steadiness that Dennis found himself grateful for in the evenings when he sat in Walter's armchair and Chester lay near the door, and neither of them needed to perform anything for the other. Nora came on weekends. She would let herself in and Chester would come to her, not with the frantic energy of a dog who had been alone, but with the contained warmth of one who recognized her as connected to the person he was waiting for. He would put his head briefly against her leg, accept her hands on his ears, and then return to his position near the door. She cried the first weekend. Not because Chester was suffering. He wasn't, not in any way she could see. He was eating, walking, sleeping in his place at the foot of Walter's bed. He was simply waiting with a patience and a certainty that she found, in its way, more moving than any dramatic display would have been. She called Walter and told him about it. Walter was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he said, "That's Chester, just that." And Nora understood that her father and his dog had a relationship whose dimensions she could observe but not fully enter, which was fine. Not everything needs to be fully entered to be fully respected. Walter asked about Chester every day. This was noted by the rehabilitation staff, who found it both routine and touching. Patients often asked about their pets. It was one of the most reliable indicators of what a person was oriented toward returning to. But Walter's questions had a specificity that was different from general pet concern. He didn't ask, "Is Chester okay?" He asked, "Is Chester still waiting by the door?" And Dennis, who had become the primary daily reporter, answered honestly each time, "Yes, he is." "He thinks I'm coming," Walter said to Nora on the phone in week 3. "You are coming," Nora said. "I know that," Walter said. "But he doesn't know when, and he's waiting anyway." A pause that had something in it. Nora recognized as her father turning something over. "That's faith," Walter said. "That's just his pure faith. No evidence, no guarantee. Just, he knows I'm coming, so he waits." Nora didn't say anything for a moment. "I want to be more like that dog," Walter said. And then, in the tone of a man who has just surprised himself, "I think I've been the opposite of that my whole life. Needed evidence for everything. Couldn't trust what I couldn't see." Nora thought about her father, the particular quality of him, the way he had moved through his life with such careful self-sufficiency, the way he had said he was fine for months, before his heart had finally made the conversation unavoidable. "Maybe the heart knew," she said. Walter was quiet. "Maybe it did," he said. He came home on a Tuesday morning in December, 5 weeks and 2 days after Nora had driven him to the hospital. Dennis drove him. Nora was inside the house, having arrived the night before, technically to prepare things. Fresh groceries, clean sheets, the specific domestic preparations of a daughter, making a home ready for a returning parent, but really just to be there. She stood in the living room and listened to Dennis's car in the driveway, and Chester, who had been lying near the door in his usual position, lifted his head. He did not immediately move. He raised his head and his ears went forward, and something passed through his body that was not visible exactly, but was present in a shift, a recognition, the specific alertness of a creature whose entire nervous system is saying, This is the sound. The car door. Footsteps on the front path, slower than before. Careful, the footsteps of a man who had been told to take things gradually and was taking them gradually, with the same deliberate attention he gave everything. Chester stood. He stood and faced the door, and his tail moved. Not the frantic wag of a dog who has been starved of attention, but something slower and more certain. The wag of a dog who knew this was coming and is now simply present for its arrival. The door opened. Walter Briggs stood in the doorway of his own home. For the first time in 5 weeks and 2 days, leaning slightly on a cane he had been issued and would use for approximately 2 more weeks before, quietly setting it aside. And Chester crossed the short distance between them and put his head against Walter's leg. Walter's hand went to Chester's ears. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Nora stood in the living room doorway watching, and did not intrude on it, because some things are complete without witnesses, and this was one of them. And she was grateful simply to be close enough to see. Walter said quietly to the top of Chester's head, "I told you I was coming." Chester's tail moved. Walter recovered, slowly, methodically, with the same stubborn deliberateness that had characterized everything he had ever done. He walked the 3 blocks to the farmer's market with Chester in February, which the cardiologist had approved and Dennis had insisted on accompanying them for. and the woman at the bread stand said Chester's name the way she always said it and gave him a treat and told Walter he looked good and Walter said he felt good. And for once in a long time when Walter Briggs said he was fine, it was the truth without the stubbornness. He called Nora differently after that. Not more often necessarily, twice a week instead of once, which in the arithmetic of their relationship was significant, but differently. With less performance of okayness, with more of the actual texture of his days. He told her when something was hard. He told her when the cardiac rehab class was discouraging. He told her when Chester did something funny, which Chester did regularly, because Chester had decided, sometime in the weeks of waiting, that life was short enough that dignity was less important than the full expression of whatever he was feeling, and he expressed it freely, and Walter found this, in a way he hadn't expected, instructive. He had needed evidence for everything. Chester had needed none. Walter was working on the distance between those two positions. It was slow work, the kind of work you do in the last chapter of a life when you have finally run out of reasons not to do it. He was doing it anyway. Every morning, Chester waited by the door while Walter got dressed. Not because Walter was going anywhere, just out of habit. The old faithful positioning of a creature who spent 5 weeks and 2 days certain of something he had no proof of. Walter thought about that every morning. He thought it was the best thing he had ever been taught.